Why empaths struggle with boundaries, the hidden conflict between ego and soul. In this post, I hope to show that self-preservation and compassion can work together and not against each other. If you identify as an empath or a highly sensitive person, you may have noticed that setting healthy boundaries feels surprisingly difficult. Perhaps you found yourself asking, why do I feel guilty saying no? Why do I always put other people's needs before my own? Why do I feel emotionally exhausted after helping others? If I put myself first, am I being selfish? These are some of the most common questions empaths ask. Many find themselves caught in an inner conflict. They genuinely want to love, support, and care for others, yet often struggle to extend that same compassion to themselves. On one side, there is a desire to protect your own well-being through healthy boundaries, and on the other, there is a deep longing to love, help, and care for others. Many people experience this tension as a battle between the ego and the soul. But what if it isn't really a battle? What if the real problem is that we've misunderstood the purpose of the ego? By exploring this question through both psychology and metaphysics, we may discover that healthy boundaries are not the opposite of compassion, but that it might be the greatest expression. For anyone new to the channel, my name is Patrice Elliott. I'm an integrative psychological therapist and a metaphysician. My work involves metapsychotherapy, mindfulness, mediumship, spiritual guidance, and metaphysical treatment. On this channel, I give simplified practical information on metaphysical, psychological, and esoteric knowledge. To help the YouTube algorithm, do like, share, subscribe, and comment. Thank you. So, why do empaths struggle with boundaries? Many empaths are naturally compassionate, but compassion alone does not explain why boundaries can feel so uncomfortable. For some, the difficulty begins much earlier in life. Childhood trauma, emotionally unpredictable environments, people-pleasing, fear of rejection, or growing up believing that love had to be earned can quietly teach us that other people's needs matters more than our own. Over time, saying yes can feel safer than saying no. Helping others can feel virtuous whilst protecting ourselves might feel selfish. Over time, the result is often emotional exhaustion, resentment, burnout, and relationship that becomes increasingly one-sided. Ironically, many empaths aren't struggling because they care too much. They're struggling because they haven't yet learned that self-care and compassion can exist together. Understanding the relationship between the ego and the soul offers another way of looking at this dilemma, where psychology meets metaphysics. To function in this world, we rely upon opposites, front and back, up and down, light and darkness, movement and stillness, and so on. Even our ability to stand and walk depends on resistance. The ground beneath our feet supports us because it resists us. Without resistance, movement would be impossible. Nature continually demonstrates that apparent oppositions are rarely in enmity against each other. More often, they are complementary forces working together to create balance. What if the relationship between the ego and the soul is no different? Before I continue, I'd like to make one thing clear. The ego and the soul are both complex concepts that have been understood in many different ways throughout psychology, philosophy, and many spiritual traditions. This article does not attempt to explain them in their entirety. Instead, I want to explore one aspect of each that I believe is especially relevant to empaths and highly sensitive people. In many contemporary spiritual communities, the ego has become something of a villain. It is often described as a thing that must be destroyed before genuine spiritual awakening can occur. I believe this is one of the greatest misunderstandings within modern spirituality. Rather than rejecting any part of ourselves, it is perhaps wiser to understand why it exists. The guardian within. One of the ego's primary function is to act as a guardian. Its role is to protect, preserve, and maintain the individual. Its fundamental concern is survival. It is in the ego's nature to keep account of what comes in and what goes out of our lives. Our time, energy, emotional investment, opportunities, and resources. In simple terms, it notices gains and losses. It asks questions such as, is this safe? Is this fair? What might I lose? What will I gain? How much have I invested and how much has the other person invested? The ego is boundary orientated. It helps us recognize where we end and the other person begins. Healthy boundaries protect our emotional well-being, allowing us to care for others without losing ourselves in the process. Without these functions, healthy self-care, healthy relationship, and even survival would be impaired. The orientation of the soul. The soul appears to move in a different direction. Where the ego distinguishes between self and other, the soul experiences connection and unity. Where the ego is primarily concerned with self-preservation, the soul naturally moves towards compassion. Where the ego naturally seeks to preserve, the soul seeks to give. Where the ego asks, how does this benefit me? The soul asks, how can I express love? Neither perspective is wrong. Each serve a different purpose. A complex ego. Most people instinctively admire soul-centered qualities such as kindness, generosity, forgiveness, patience, and compassion. And that is perfectly understandable. But have you ever wondered why we admire these qualities? What if our appreciation for compassionate people is in itself partly one of the ego's function? From an evolutionary perspective, we are safer with people who are nurturing, trustworthy, and cooperative. It is therefore natural that we are more drawn towards these characters. In other words, even our admiration for compassion may be in part rooted in our instinct for self-preservation. If I may briefly digress, this is one of the reasons love bombing can be such an effective form of manipulation. By overwhelming someone with affection, attention, validation, and care, unhealthy individuals can lower another person's natural defenses, creating a false sense of trust before control or exploitation begins. And this also follows the cult programming. The shadow. Many empaths become uncomfortable with the ego's natural concern for self-care, boundaries, and self-preservation because these qualities are sometimes mistaken as selfish. They are denied, judged, or pushed into the background. Carl Jung refers to these rejected aspects of ourselves as the shadow. Rejecting the ego does not eliminate it. Instead, these rejected parts of ourself returns unconsciously through resentment, projection, self-neglect, emotional exhaustion, burnout, people-pleasing, or what many describe as self-sabotage. Many empaths become trapped in a painful cycle. They ignore their own needs to avoid disappointing others, believing this makes them more compassionate. Over time, the emotional costs will surface because compassion without healthy boundaries is unsustainable. If we were to live entirely from a soul-centered orientation without the balancing influence of a healthy ego, we would likely become emotionally depleted and increasingly vulnerable to manipulation, exploitation, and abuse. Integration, not opposition. A healthy understanding of the ego helps us become more balanced. We no longer feel guilty for protecting our own well-being. Instead, we recognize that setting healthy boundaries is not the opposite of compassion. It is often what allows compassion to remain healthy, authentic, and sustainable. Caring for ourselves does not diminish our capacity to care for others, it strengthens it. The goal was never to choose between the ego and the soul, but instead to understand the purpose of both. The ego reminds us that our needs matters. The soul reminds us that the needs of others matters too. When both of these aspects unite, they teach us that we can care for others without abandoning ourselves, and that we can care for ourselves without abandoning and exploiting others. Psychological and spiritual integration reminds us that every human being, including ourselves, is equally deserving of dignity, respect, care, and compassion. When the ego and the soul work together in harmony, self-care and compassion cease to compete. Instead, they become complementary expressions of a balanced, integrated life. When the ego is understood, the soul is made free. We need not wrestle between the ego and the soul. Rather, we need to understand the wisdom within both. When these two aspects of ourselves work in harmony, healthy boundaries no longer feel selfish. Instead, they become an expression of emotional maturity, psychological integration, and authentic compassion. The healthiest empaths are not those who give until there is nothing left to give. They are those who have learned that caring for themselves is not the opposite of caring for others. It is what makes genuine compassion possible. Healthy boundaries do not weaken compassion, they protect it. True wholeness is found not in choosing between the ego and the soul, but in allowing each to fulfill its right purpose. If this video resonated with you, do like and subscribe, and leave me a comment and let me know what you think of this content. I'm recording from Jamaica. Let me know where you're listening from. And do remember, your mind is your greatest asset. Take care of it, and it will take care of you.